recording now, waiting for the little red light to come up. Yay, there we go. So yes, enough of me talking. We are utterly delighted that Dr. Luna Dolezal has agreed to join us this morning. Luna's already had a really pivotal influence on developing the thinking within our network. And this morning is an opportunity for us to learn about Luna's most recent research, which encourages us to consider why a trauma-informed approach requires shame-sensitive practice. So Dr. Luna Dolezal, I'll read your bio. Luna is an Associate Professor of Philosophy and Medical Humanities at the University of Exeter. She leads on 2 major research projects that investigate how shame is relevant in healthcare and public health, so that's shame in medicine and scenes of shame and stigma in COVID-19. Part of her research has been to consider the relevance of shame in experiences of trauma and post-trauma states. Along with her research team, the aim of Luna's current research is to develop principles of shame-sensitive practice that can be applied within healthcare contexts and also within other care and social services. So really, really excited to have Luna with us this morning. You're not here to listen to me. I shall pass you over. Luna, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for having me. It's really lovely to be here speaking to the network again. I think the first time I spoke to the network was just over a year ago. And so this talk is very much a development of the talk I gave previously, which just touched on some of the connections between trauma and shame. And since I gave that talk, I've had many conversations with people from the network and Christian Tomlin from Devon County Council. And one day earlier this year, I think in March, he asked me, so what's the difference between shame-sensitive practice and trauma-informed approaches? And that led me to write this paper, which gives an overview of the trauma-informed approach, how shame is central to trauma and post-trauma states, and then makes a case for shame-sensitive practice as being really important to be integrated into any sort of trauma-informed practice. So I'll start the paper shortly. I saw some people haven't received the slides. The reason I asked for the slides to be sent out in advance is that I'm going to be talking about trauma and shame, and some of this might potentially be upsetting or triggering. So yeah, just keep that in mind as I'm going through. This is quite an academic talk, so it has been written to be published as an academic paper. So I apologize in advance if it comes across quite academic, but I think in the discussion there's plenty of time. We've got 2 hours, so there's plenty of time to delve more deeply into the practical side of the material, which follows from the more theoretical side. So I'm going to share my screen and open share tray. That's it, isn't it? Yeah, and these are the slides that Vicky had circulated to some people, or to most of you. So I get the slide. Okay, great. So I've given everyone a sort of background of how this work has come about, and I'm really delighted to be able to share it. I mean, the main aim of our research, my research and the research of my team, is to create kind of shame awareness, raise awareness of the impacts that experiences like shame and other negative self-conscious emotions have in the context of healthcare. Primarily, that's our research is primarily focused in healthcare, but also in other caring professions and in other services, and how shame can often act as this really concrete barrier and very concretely impact the way professionals and clients and patients experience interactions. And what's very interesting is that anecdotally, we probably all realize that's the case, but there's not much research about it and not much open acknowledgement about these dynamics. So the aim of our work is to really try and like lift the lid on the silence around shame. So for those of you who don't already know me, Vicky just introduced me. I'm a philosopher at the University of Exeter. I have a big research project called Shame in Medicine, as Vicky mentioned, which looks at the role of shame in health and medicine. And the overall aim of that project is to create shame-sensitive healthcare. So in the realm of medicine, there's a little bit of evidence about how shame and negative self-conscious emotions impact in the clinical encounter. So patients who experience shame or embarrassment might avoid seeking treatments. They might lie to healthcare professionals or not disclose all of the circumstances of their physical condition or their lifestyle. They might conceal diagnoses. They might not follow through with treatment. So there is a little bit of evidence that shame can be this barrier, but surprisingly, there's not much evidence. There's almost no empirical research that explores this. So my main collaborator on this project is a social scientist and social worker based at the University of Birmingham, who's undertaking a big piece of qualitative research. We're recruiting doctors. So if anyone in the room is a doctor, we're recruiting doctors to take part in the study. And you can visit our project website. I've put the link there to read more about that qualitative research that we're doing. We're also recruiting patients. So actually, I might put it into the chat after the. We have another website where participants can sign up for our study. Okay, so I'm going to just jump into the talk. I'm reading from my iPad, so apologies if I'm looking away, if you can see me. So experiences of trauma are widespread, and there exists a wealth of evidence directly correlating trauma to a range of poor social and health outcomes, which incur substantial costs to individuals and to society. So trauma has been positioned as a significant public health issue, which many have argued necessitates a trauma-informed approach to public health policy agendas. Shame is a key emotional after effect of experiences of trauma, and emerging literature argues that we may have failed to see the obvious by neglecting to acknowledge the influence of shame on post-trauma disorders. So in this talk, I argue that effectively addressing post-trauma states necessitates a clear understanding of chronic shame, its phenomenology, and its effects. Failure to identify and address shame in post-trauma states and within trauma-informed approaches can be detrimental, potentially compounding trauma, disrupting treatment, and leading to the ineffectiveness of interventions designed to help individuals. So offering strategies for shame-sensitive practice, I suggest the need for shame competence in health, social, and care services and within public health. The term trauma-informed, as many of you probably know or may know, was introduced by Harris and Fallett in 2001 as a means to interrogate an understanding of trauma and its after effects into mental health services, following the evidence that a significant number of individuals accessing mental health services were survivors of physical and sexual abuse. Since their early conceptualization of the trauma-informed approach, an expanding body of conceptual, empirical, and public health research correlating trauma with a wide range of social, psychiatric, psychological, behavioral, and physical problems has led to the redesigning and reconceptualization of some health and social services using the trauma-informed paradigm as a way to structure the way that care is delivered. So adopting a trauma-informed approach attempts to embed an understanding of how experiences of trauma can become central to an individual's life course and life outcomes, having profound negative effect on social outcomes, emotional well-being, mental and physical health, along with health-relevant behavior. Research demonstrates that individuals who have experienced trauma can have adverse outcomes in all areas of life, and that these effects can endure across a lifetime. These individuals are significantly more likely to suffer from chronic health issues, mental health problems, and substance use problems, as well as being correlated with outcomes such as homelessness, violence, marital problems, and incarceration, among others. In health and social care contexts, applying a trauma lens can powerfully elucidate the root causes of ill health, health-related behaviors, and social difficulties, leading to more effective interventions, support diagnoses, and treatments. So trauma-informed approaches involve a paradigm shift in how services and professionals respond to patients and clients, attempting to address root causes rather than surface symptoms, reframing the core diagnostic question from inquiring what is wrong with you to understanding what happened to you. And central to the trauma-informed approach is an understanding that typical emotional, psychological, and social after effects of trauma, which directly impede an individual's ability to seek out and engage with health and social services that are designed to help them. In addition, when trauma survivors do manage to engage with the services that may help them, the interactions they have with organization staff and care providers who do not recognize and understand their trauma and its after effects may inadvertently lead to further disengagement and entrenchment of their problems, and that these services are designed to diagnose and treat. So in light of this substantial research regarding trauma and its after effects, the trauma-informed approach acknowledges the particular vulnerabilities and triggers that traditional service delivery approaches may exacerbate for trauma survivors, redesigning services to be more sensitive and supportive, with the aim of avoiding re-traumatization and any additional harm. So considering shame, so shame has recently been included in the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in the DSM-5 under the umbrella of persistent negative emotional states. So shame has recently come to be identified in the trauma literature as part of a constellation of negative emotions, along with emotions like fear, horror, anger, and guilt, that are common for trauma survivors in the post-traumatic state. Understanding shame and its role in the post-traumatic state is, I argue, central to the success of the trauma-informed approach. So what is shame? The term shame could be considered an umbrella term that refers to a whole range of experiences, including cognate emotions like embarrassment, chagrin, mortification, and humiliation. The psychiatrist James Gilligan gives a useful analogy. He notes that in the same way that we use the term flower as a generic term to refer to a wide variety of different but related plants, then the term shame encompasses a wide range of experiences, including feelings of being slighted, insulted, disrespected, dishonored, disgraced, demeaned, treated with contempt, ridiculed, mocked, rejected, feelings of inferiority, inadequacy, of being a failure, losing face, being treated as if one is insignificant, unimportant, or worthless. In general, shame is commonly characterized as a negative self-conscious emotion. Sorry, phone is ringing. It is an experience that arises when we are concerned about how we are seen and judged by others. We feel shame when we are seen by another or others, whether they are present, imagined, or simply a viewpoint that has been internalized, to be flawed in some crucial way, or when some part of our core self is perceived to be inadequate, inappropriate, or immoral. During a shame experience, we can feel deeply and irreparably flawed, unworthy, and unlovable, and that our social position and our social bonds are under threat. Shame is an experience that is alienating and isolating and can be deeply disturbing. It can provoke powerful feelings of despair, inferiority, powerlessness, defectiveness, and self-contempt, to name a few. In addition, shame itself is shameful and taboo. And for these reasons, shame is usually avoided, shunned, or kept secret at all costs, both individually and collectively. Now, while shame can be a very negative experience for an individual, it is inevitable and also a necessary part of human life. So healthy shame can lead to the expression of positive attributes such as modesty, humility, and gratitude, along with the respect for oneself and others. It can be a powerful motivating force for personal growth and change, and in forging harmonious and meaningful relations with others. So healthy shame is a pro-social, usually considered to be a pro-social emotion. However, unhealthy shame is very easily distorted and can become unhealthy, maladaptive, or destructive. Sometimes called toxic shame or pathological shame, is corrosive and pernicious and can lead to a pervasive and enduring sense of inferiority, inadequacy, defectiveness, along with a sense of not being worthy of respect, love, or connection. It's an experience that can organize oneself, life, and world, and having a deep significance and an impact on an individual and their life chances. So toxic or pathological shame usually occurs in what's called a chronic form, or is usually termed chronic shame. The theologian Stephen Pattison writes about chronic shame. He says, there is an enormous difference between acute reactive shame and the chronic shame that shapes a whole personality and may last a lifetime. When individuals appear to experience the whole of life as actually or potentially shame productive and manifest such symptoms as withdrawal, self-contempt, inferiority, and gaze aversion as a matter of course throughout their everyday life, shame has become pathological and chronic. And chronic shame is frequently characterized firstly by a nagging possibility of shame, and secondly by a persistent sense of inadequacy, defilement, or failure, or lesser self-worth. And it can be characterized by what Leon Wurzmer terms a shame attitude, where one's entire personality and character is structured around shame and shame avoidance. So what's interesting about chronic shame is that it is a very elusive experience. So what comes to dominate experience isn't shame, but is a pernicious form of anticipated shame or persistent and heightened shame anxiety, of which an individual may or may not be aware. Shame anxiety appears in experience as a corrosive, undermining and persistent fear or anxiety about being objectified, judged, labeled, and rejected by others. By others. It is a persistent fear of disgrace and being looked at by others with contempt. It's important to note that shame anxiety may not be experienced as shame. Instead, it may be dominated by shame avoidance, and as such, characterized by emotions like fear, anxiety, self-consciousness, stress, or powerful impulses to hide, avoid, or escape, along with negative feelings about the self. It is clear that a significant cause of persistent chronic shame is trauma, where childhood relational trauma and traumatic experiences in later life are strongly correlated with experiences of chronic shame and shame anxiety. So as noted above, chronic shame is usually positioned in discussions regarding the after effects of trauma as one of the many emotional responses that may occur in the wake of trauma, with fear often identified as the other dominant emotion. However, there is an increasing body of literature that positions shame as the keystone affect of trauma and the post-traumatic state. Traumatology research has seen the development of the idea that shame and trauma are inextricably linked, where some argue that post-traumatic shame is a key experience that shapes the post-traumatic state, while others have come to theorize and describe PTSD as a shame disorder. At present, there is a growing literature that explores the centrality of shame for individuals who have experienced trauma. And this body of research argues that shame is a world-organizing affect or emotion for many trauma survivors, and that shame is behind much of the maladaptive behavior associated with trauma, PTSD, and other post-traumatic states. The cause of shame in the post-traumatic state is complex, but there seems to be a multitude of overlapping factors which render shame a predominant, if not the dominant, emotional experience following trauma. So from the literature, there are quite a few different examples. So research demonstrates that shame can be brought on by, firstly, the traumatic experience itself, or incorrect or inaccurate feelings of blame or responsibility for what happened in the traumatic event. Feelings of defilement and unlovability as a result of neglect or abuse, particularly in childhood. Rumination about one's behaviors, actions, and reactions at the time of trauma. The sense of being damaged or defiled as a result of having experienced trauma or having a trauma diagnosis such as PTSD. The symptoms of PTSD or the post-traumatic state. Shame may attach to the labels attached to one's identity as a result of trauma or post-traumatic outcomes, labels like victim or survivor or addict or homeless. Shame might occur because of the coping mechanisms one engages in to cope with trauma, the fear of judgment by others if they discover one's trauma, the social taboos associated with the trauma one has experienced, revealing trauma in clinical and psychotherapeutic encounters. Shame might occur because of falling short of one's own ideals and standards, and because of the taboo and shameful nature of shame itself. So in addressing the impacts of emotions for trauma survivors for the treatment of PTSD and within the trauma-informed approach, the trauma researcher Taylor asked the question, have we failed to see the obvious with respect to the influence of shame on post-trauma disorders? So understanding shame, and in particular chronic shame, as a key consequence of trauma experience has the potential to elucidate the root cause of a range of maladaptive behaviors associated with trauma. However, as noted above, chronic shame is difficult to identify and diagnose. It's an elusive experience that is often disguised or camouflaged by other experiences and feelings. The relational psychotherapist Patricia DeYoung who's written a book which is brilliant called Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame. I highly recommend. She notes that what those who suffer from chronic shame may not daily or consciously expect to be annihilated by shame. However, the thread is always around somewhere, just out of awareness and kept at bay. What individuals live with is not shame, but what it costs them to keep from falling into shame. As a result, what characterizes the experience of chronic shame in the post-traumatic state is not enduring or repetitive experiences of shame, but rather an atmosphere of anticipated shame or shame anxiety that leads to compensatory behaviors and experiences. And in this way, in experiences of chronic shame, shame itself often becomes invisible, and what dominates experience is other behaviors or feelings which are used to help circumvent or avoid shame, or to mask or cope with the pain of shame. As a result, living with chronic shame can lead to a range of compensatory behaviors. And these are powerful defensive scripts or strategies or rules or habits of interaction, which make it possible for an individual to avoid the social threat, pain, and emotional anguish that comes with shame and its chronic anticipation. As Langsy notes, I quote, post-traumatic state gives rise to shame and to defenses that keep shame arousing awareness from consciousness. And Wilson and their researchers concur, noting that, and I quote, the powerful emotions of post-traumatic shame are associated with a broad range of avoidance behaviors: isolation, detachment, withdrawal, hiding, non-appearance, self-imposed exile, cancellation of appointments, surrender of responsibility, emotional constriction, psychic numbness, emotional flatness, and non-confrontation with others, end quote. These avoidance behaviors help an individual protect themselves from shame through avoidance or by placing it outside of awareness. And in this way, shame can, as Wilson et al. Note, and I quote, operate unconsciously in trauma complexes and initiate self-destructive and self-defeating modalities of behavior, end quote. What becomes problematic in understanding and treating trauma and the post-traumatic state is that these avoidance behaviors are easily misread. These avoidance behaviors for shame are easily misread, and shame often becomes invisibilized and consequently unacknowledged in efforts to provide care, treatment, and support. In fact, it has been demonstrated that shame is a potent treatment barrier for trauma survivors, leading to outright avoidance and to dropping out and attrition once engaged with care and services. There is ample evidence that the necessity to avoid shame or shameful exposure can interfere with individuals accessing healthcare and also individuals from reporting traumatic incidents such as abuse, sexual assault, and violence. In addition, shame prevents the reporting of shame itself, as individuals in clinical settings are sometimes reluctant to disclose feelings of shame out of fear from being exposed and rejected. Shame itself is shameful and taboo. In these complex and overlapping ways, shame experiences lead to concealment and avoidance, consistent with the hallmark symptoms of PTSD and post-traumatic states. Hence, in the context of seeking help through healthcare or social services, individuals who are chronically anxious about shameful exposure may avoid seeking help in the first place, may regularly miss appointments, may avoid disclosing honest details about traumatic events, lifestyle, or circumstances, may fail to follow through with treatments, may conceal diagnoses, and coping behaviors from friends, family, and professionals. In fact, not only is shame a barrier to accessing services, it is very easily exacerbated and incited in the context of seeking help from professionals. Interactions with care professionals can compound feelings of shame, as these interactions often, or if not always, involve unequal power relations, a fear of being judged, the scrutiny and exposure of one's potentially shameful past, circumstances, coping behaviors, body illnesses, mental health status, along with other vulnerabilities. It seems clear that being attuned to experiences of shame and chronic shame, along with the common scripts or strategies deployed to avoid shame and shameful exposure, becomes central to achieving trauma-informed practice. and in fact central to facilitating individuals to seek help and engage with healthcare and social services. So while shame is acknowledged fleetingly in some of the grey literature that addresses how to implement trauma-informed approaches, for the most part, any articulation of shame and its effects in post-traumatic states remains conspicuously absent from the literature and research regarding trauma-informed care. As has been discussed, shame is a powerful driver of behavior in post-trauma states and can deeply affect if and how individuals engage with services and care providers. Having the capacity on the levels of policy, organizations, and individual practitioners to address shame directly is imperative, considering how impactful shame can be for those who have experienced trauma and post-trauma states. Being attentive to shame and acknowledging its significance for individuals in care contexts can improve both engagement and outcomes. So using a shame lens alongside a trauma lens is necessary for trauma-informed approaches to achieve the goal of redesigning services to be more sensitive and supportive, with the ultimate aim of avoiding re-traumatization and any additional harm. As a result, trauma-informed approaches must begin to integrate shame-sensitive practice. So drawing from what is shame-sensitive practice? Drawing from the pioneering work of Matthew Gibson, who's my collaborator in Birmingham, shame-sensitive practice involves not only attempts at minimizing unhealthy shame, thereby reducing potentially damaging and debilitating effects of shame, but also an awareness of shame dynamics, where practitioners are more attuned to bypass, deflected, or invisibilize shame and its consequences, while also being alert to ways that shame and shaming may be produced through organizational practices and policies. In this way, shame-sensitive practice is integrated at the interpersonal level in interactions between practitioner colleagues and between practitioners and clients or patients, and also at the organizational and policy levels, with an understanding of how institutional structures, practices, and policy decisions can exacerbate or create conditions for shame and shaming. There are obvious overlaps and synergies with the main principles which guide trauma-informed approaches. However, focusing through a shame lens will reveal significant affective or emotional dynamics that are often otherwise occluded or invisibilized. While there are a variety of ways to implement shame sensitivity in practice, and these should be tailored to the specificity of the service provision in question, whether it is healthcare, social work, policing, counseling, etc. I offer here some principles on developing shame sensitivity and some core principles which guides shame sensitive practice. So the next two slides, I'm going to go through first on this first slide. So principles for shame sensitive, on the side here, principles for shame sensitive practice for practitioners and within organizations to start. So firstly, creating individual shame competence. And so practitioners must have a theoretical and practical understanding of shame before they can identify it and start to develop competence with working with it. Practitioners must understand what shame is, be aware of, and be able to identify behaviors that are used to cope with shame. Practitioners must also be aware of shame dynamics and how shame circulates interpersonally, developing ongoing competence in identifying their own shame and its effects on their thinking, actions, and behavior within professional practice. Creating organizational shame competence. Individual shame competence must be developed within a framework of organizational shame competence. This would involve the fostering of emotional intelligence within professional practice, where speaking about and understanding emotions and their effects within professional practice becomes commonplace. In particular, the taboo regarding shame and shameful or stigmatized states and experience must be directly addressed. Organizations must create and systematize nuanced and collaborative understandings of how shame is produced and experienced as a result of their policies and practices, avoiding attributing blame and shame to individuals where there is a disconnect between policy and operational capacity, especially in cases of chronic underfunding. Collective accountability for shame-sensitive or shame-reducing practice begins with mutually agreed goals and frames of reference. And this could take the form of an institutional code of conduct or shame-proofing toolkit. Cultures and practices of shaming and blaming must be avoided within organizations. Cultures of openness, learning, and emotional intelligence should be fostered. Avoiding shame in policy and practice. Reject using shame or shaming as a behavioral tool of any kind in policy making or practice. Not all shaming is accidental, and many initiatives rely on a shame response as the effective driver of the change they hope to promote. For example, shame is frequently used in public health campaigns, for example, to combat obesity or improve hygiene. So be alert to how shaming may become implicit within policies and practice, for instance, through the use of stigmatizing language or through creating dynamics of blame and individual responsibility for circumstances or conditions that may be resulting from structural conditions, so things like poverty or obesity, or that may stem from post-trauma coping behaviors, addiction or mental ill health, for instance. So continuous assessment of practice for shame and shaming. Organizations and practitioners must conduct frequent and challenging reviews and audits on work of any description which has the potential to generate, spread, or exacerbate shame. And this involves vulnerability and requires critical reflection on past and future practice. There must be willingness to admit mistakes, openness to critical reflection, and flexibility to make responsive changes in policy and practice. And creating a culture of engaged practice in order to reduce social harms and stigma. The systemic forces which shape and define what is stigmatized or what is considered shameful are not unchangeable. So in addition, many causes of trauma, for example, social deprivation or domestic abuse, many causes of trauma have their roots in societal and structural conditions which can be changed and improved. Practitioners, along with leaders and managers within organizations, must be given the resources and encouraged to be engaged in making meaningful changes. This will happen through creating cultures of engaged practice and political activity where individuals are encouraged to write to local councillors or members of parliament, carry out research, engage with academic partners, become involved in local and national campaigns, engage with media outlets, etc., with the overall aim for advocating and agitating for more humane and shame-sensitive changes in law, policy, and practice. Okay, and then moving on to principles for shame-sensitive practice when engaging with individuals. So for practitioners, engaging with clients, patients, or service users. So having shame competence to recognize shame and shame dynamics. Shame is frequently hidden and unacknowledged, and it is notoriously difficult to admit to. Because it is also taboo and shameful, individuals go to great lengths to hide shame and what they consider to be shameful. Practitioners must become adept at using a shame lens to identify shame through both physiological and psychological indicators. Practitioners must become aware of common verbal, paralinguistic, and nonverbal cues that might indicate a shame state, which include postural and embodied cues or common terms used instead of shame, like self-conscious, embarrassed, foolish, worthless, inept, inferior. Practitioners must also become adept at recognizing bypass shame through knowledge and recognition of common avoidance behaviors for shame, behaviors like aggression or violence, withdrawal, addiction, perfectionism, and there are many others. Practitioners must also become alert to shame dynamics within interpersonal encounters, recognizing that shame is a two-way street and also contagious. This means it can transfer from client, patient, or service user to the practitioner, infecting an entire interaction. Being able to recognize and manage these dynamics in order to minimize harm on both sides of the relationship is essential. So avoid explicit shaming in interpersonal encounters with clients, patients, or service users. Always avoid explicit shaming, judgment, or blaming of individuals. And also avoiding implicit shaming. In interpersonal encounters, practitioners must be alert to the potential for implicit shaming in interactions, recognizing that relationships with care professionals can be inherently shaming. Clients patients and service users are expected to expose their vulnerabilities, including their physical bodies, their lifestyle, their illnesses, their mental health status, and potentially share intimate details about their past, their families, their feelings, etc. And all of this in a context where there is usually an unequal power relationship, along with scrutiny and professional assessment. Practitioners must remain alert to and continuously assess how the language they use, their demeanor, their questioning style, their emotional expression, and other interpersonal dynamics may inadvertently produce a shame response. And consideration must be given to interpersonal dynamics based on gender, race, ethnicity, the language spoken, disability, age, religion, along with other factors in particular situations. So, for example, a female police officer might be the most, as we might say, shame-appropriate practitioner to interact with a female victim of sexual assault. Practitioners should also avoid stereotyping, labeling, and other stigmatizing ways of engaging with individuals. It is important to remain responsive to individuals and their unique circumstances and genuinely acknowledge distress. Addressing shame with sensitivity. It is important to acknowledge shame in order to help normalize and alleviate it. And unacknowledged and unspoken shame can give the toxic beliefs that are inherent in shame some legitimacy. Uncovering shame in a safe and sensitive way can help shift the burden of shame and also shift behaviors that might be in place to keep shame at bay in social care and health provider settings, for example, withdrawal or avoidance or non-disclosure. However, addressing shame must be done with sensitivity. For some, even the word shame can be intensely triggering, such that it might be best approached indirectly through using other terms. It is also important that distress is acknowledged without immediately closing down discussions to focus on prevention and solutions. So, in addition, shame disclosures are intensely vulnerable, so there must be attentiveness to support and connection after sensitive disclosures. Okay, understanding the particularities of shame for different groups. Engage with and collaborate with communities and groups to understand particular sensitivities to shame, along with common behavioral responses to bypass shame as related to specific trauma experiences. Continuously engage to foster supportive networks and relationship-based practice, shifting emphasis away from individual responsibility and decision-making, understanding that this approach creates shame and making space for attention to the structural and collective determinants of health, trust, dignity, and equity. And I think this might be the last one. Yes, the last one. Creating sustainable connection and supportive networks. Shame is fundamentally a fear of rejection and losing meaningful connections to others. As a result, in shame responses, individuals can feel isolated and they can feel shy, and they can shy away from reaching out to people who may be able to offer help for fear of rejection and further shame. It is imperative that practitioners engage in practice that can create sustainable relationships alongside supportive networks, so that individuals feel that they are understood, recognized, and respected by the practitioners that are supporting them. Practitioners and services must be continuously proactive in reaching out to individuals, especially when they disengage. Continuity in relationships with individual practitioners and particular services should be prioritized so meaningful relationships grounded in familiarity and trust can be developed. Clients, patients, and service users should not be made to feel cut off, disconnected, or discarded from services. Structural factors such as the availability of appointment times, accessibility of clinical spaces, ease through which one can contact the service, length of waiting lists, the duration of service, continuity between services must be continually assessed to ensure that individuals feel supported and a sense of connection is maintained. Post-trauma states can last years and even a lifetime, so there must be attentiveness to long-term support. So just to conclude, addressing trauma means that that shame must not only be acknowledged, but must also be addressed. Offering strategies for shame-sensitive practice, I hope this talk has highlighted the need for shame competence in health, social and care services, and within public health, and has demonstrated how the integration of shame-sensitive practice could enhance the trauma-informed approach. And just on this slide, on the talk I gave last year, I think I had a similar slide where some books from which some of this work has come from. The second last on the right is Matthew Gibson's book, Pride and Shame in Child and Family Social Work. He's my main collaborator up in Birmingham, and I really highly recommend his work. And he has been instrumental in developing the idea of shame-sensitive practice, particularly in social work contexts. And the book on the far right, Patricia DeYoung's book, Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame, is also really interesting and goes into some depth about the relationship between relational trauma and shame, and chronic shame in particular. Great, thank you. So if you're interested in this research or have ideas about how shame-sensitive practice might be relevant to your field of practice, please do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you if you are interested. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my slides so I can see everyone.
Luna, that was fantastic. Goodness, what a rich and dense presentation. There's just so much there to absorb. I'm just going to stop the recording.
I wanted to say before I started, I actually had COVID last week. I'm still in self-isolation. I'm sitting on a bed in our spare room trying to look professional from like the waist up.